So, welcome everybody to this special episode of Come and See. Firstly, a huge thanks to everybody who sent us feedback over the last few weeks of Lent. We've really enjoyed seeing what you've got to say. My name's Stephen Buckley. I'm Director of Comms for the Diocese of Oxford.
My name's Tina Molyneux. I'm the Head of Discipleship and Social Justice for the Diocese.
And I'm Bishop Stephen, the Bishop of Oxford, and I've really enjoyed sitting and praying each morning as we've gone through Come and See this year.
So Bishop Stephen, we're going to start with a question from your superfan, Emma, actually. So Emma's been with us for Come and See each year for the last 3 years, and she said, yeah, Come and See's been brilliant, but she's doing it this year instead of giving up chocolate. So the first easy question for you, Bishop Stephen, is what have you given up or started for Lent this year?
Well, I've been doing Come and See every day with everybody else, and I haven't actually given anything up this year, so I'm a bit like Emma, but I've tried to do some extra things as I've gone through Lent, especially in my reading. So extra bits of reading has been my Lenten journey this year. I did wonder whether to start cycling into the office instead of taking my car. And I've made it once so far in Lent, which is a miserable failure. But the weather's been quite bad.
We'll forgive you that, Bishop Stephen. So we're going to move through the questions, and we have some really moving stuff that came in around what does it mean to live as a Christian today? What does our faith mean in the world today? That kind of thing. So starting at the top with kind of an obvious question that many people will ask, but we heard from both Peter and Janine. When we see such suffering in the world today, earthquakes, poverty, and we ask ourselves, where is a loving God in these situations and why does he allow such suffering? It's easy to lose heart when we're praying into this. What would you say to Peter and Janine?
I think it is easy to lose heart. Suffering is overwhelming. It's all around us, and the news cycle brings it to us all day. And if we check our phones when we're having downtime as well. And the Beatitudes encourage us to be compassionate towards all that suffering in the world. We can never know the answers to those questions fully, but the Beatitudes also tell us, and the Gospels tell us, that God comes to be with us in all of that suffering and takes his place alongside us, and that Jesus himself enters into it. So we don't know the reasons why, but we do know that God understands and is with us in the suffering and the pain.
You mentioned that the issue about the news that we're all consuming. I was reading something really interesting last night about, taking care about what you're consuming. It's not to be unknowledgeable about the world, but actually constantly looking at our news apps isn't necessarily a good thing. How do you maintain that balance, Bishop Stephen?
Well, I try and keep myself well informed. So I read a newspaper each day. I try and watch television news once a day, so that's my balance. But I found I can too easily get then addicted to what's going on. So I am careful about what else I look at. And one of the things that's happened to me during the last few weeks is that my Twitter feed has been hacked. And that's made me give up Twitter because it's been very difficult to get it unhacked and get back on. And actually, I've really appreciated that, stepping back from social media, and I think I'm going to make it permanent. I think it's better for my mental health. So yeah. I could have said that's another thing I've given up for Lent, but it wasn't intentional.
So Janine goes on to ask about how we can be Jesus peacemakers in this world. Could you expand a little bit more on that?
I think the opportunity to be peacemakers is all around us. I think it is there in our families often, our extended families as well as our immediate families and our groups of friends. It can be there in our churches where people don't always find it easy to agree, and we can carry a determination to be the people who bring peace and reconciliation and hope into different situations. It can be there in our attitudes to creation, because the biblical idea of shalom embraces our relationship with creation as well at the moment. So all that we do in terms of creation care helps us to be peacemakers. I think it's partly a matter of intent and looking for those opportunities and then taking them in different ways as they apply to us.
And we had a question along those lines from Morris, who was particularly taken with, the disconnect between the Met Police and the general public at the moment, and that was the example that he gave. But it sort of works into a broader sense as well, which is, what's it mean to model the Beatitudes in a way that perhaps does something about bringing the extremes of society back together, or extremes of opinion back together?
Yeah, I think the more we model the Beatitudes, the more we are able to build public trust and confidence, not in us as perfect people, because that always leads to disappointment when any of us project that about ourselves, but as people who are intentionally trying to be the best they can be, and placing this template, this beautiful portrait that Jesus gives, right at the heart of the character we want to have. And I think all of that builds public trust and confidence and reassurance, and also is in a period when people are looking for models which go deeper, provides a model to the whole of society, I think.
Okay, thank you. So in a moment, Tina's going to pick up on some questions we've had around the Beatitudes, but a consistent theme of all the questions people sent in was to say, how does the bishop deal with X, Y, Z? And there's some quite tough old questions in there. And Sinead was asking about how you, Bishop Stephen, deal with your own suffering in life, greed, hardship, watching others suffer. And I guess really the question is how does your faith, get you through those moments?
Thank you. They are very interesting and deep questions. I think in different ways, according to the particular grief and suffering. I ask questions of, as anybody else does, when bad and difficult things happen to those I love. I sometimes get angry with God, as the people in the Psalms do, often when bad things happen in the world, especially to those who are defenseless and vulnerable. I think I've learned over the years to try and use those questions to take me towards God, even if that means saying some cross and difficult things to God, rather than form a barrier between me and God and turning me away. And that means there's a sort of holding and being held in the love of God through that process, even as you're processing it. I think having time and space as well to process bad things when they happen, and then sometimes simply to grieve and to weep when things go really badly for people, and you see difficult things in the world. I think that's what it means to mourn.
So I'm going to kick off with a question from Dennis, which is quite a tricky one. He's talking about instances in Jesus' teaching which are strict. For example, if your eye sins, gouge it out. But the Beatitudes are encouraging statements. So Dennis wants to know how we should reconcile this.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question, Dennis. Jesus is a brilliant teacher, and he uses all kinds of ways to help us remember his teaching. And one of the things that I think is one of Jesus' favourite devices he uses in his teaching is what's called hyperbole, which is stating something to an extreme in order to help it to be memorable and in order to help you to think really powerfully. So that's a massive hyperbole. If your eye offends you, pluck it out. Jesus does not mean that people should go around plucking their eyes out, of course. He uses hyperbole in the example of can a camel pass through the eye of a needle? He uses hyperbole in we should forgive 70 times 7. It's through the exaggeration that we see the massive challenge that's there, but actually the saying then sticks in our minds and we go back to it more than we would if, for example, somebody like me said, just try and do it a bit more. Jesus' teaching stays with us.
Really interesting. We've got a few questions that are coming up. A little bit about the audience. Jesus knows his audience, and he's as you say, he's speaking to his audience. So one of those themes is around the Old Testament. Of course, the people at the time would have a different reference point to the reference points that we have. So Jenny asks, do any or all of the Beatitudes occur in the Old Testament? Was Jesus the first person to preach them as a blueprint of how to live well? Thinking about Old Testament
I think
parables.
Jesus is, the first person to do that. But there are examples in the Old Testament of individual sayings. So at the beginning of Psalm 1, blessed is the man who does not walk in the way of the ungodly. Psalm 41, blessed is he who considers the poor. There are different blessed sayings throughout. So what Jesus is doing in the Beatitudes is taking some of the great Old Testament themes of justice and meekness and humility and combining them in this poetic set of sayings, each of which begins with blessed and ends with a beautiful promise. And I think that's original to Jesus' own teaching. And you find other sayings beginning with the word blessed as you go through the rest of the New Testament as well. So it's not unique to Jesus and to Matthew's Gospel in the New Testament. But this connection in Matthew 5 is, I think, unique and very, very distinctive.
Interesting. So I'm going to move on to a question from John. John refers to the fact that you gave us the idea of the portrait on day 19, and that's obviously one of the themes that we focus on, one of the lenses that we look at the Beatitudes, the portrait of Jesus. So he's referring to day 19, and he said that we see the portrait of Jesus in the Beatitudes. The following days, you enlarge on the idea of the portrait, but he was surprised with day 22 when 7 acts of mercy are introduced. And these are based on the 6 acts in Matthew 25. But he says the added number 7 is about death. He would have preferred if the added act was not about death, but the added act was to reflect the humour and the socialising that Jesus did. So his suggestion is that can we have number 7 to be the 7th act of mercy to socialise with others or to bring joy to others? It's got my vote.
I think that's a really interesting suggestion, Dennis. It's a very interesting thing that the 7 acts of mercy are in church history in the first 1500 years of the church. They are a really important thing in describing the services Christians aim to do for others. Until about 500 or 600 years ago in Britain, there was no public service for the burial of the dead and for the disposal of the reverent disposal of the deceased. It depended on neighbours looking after each other in that respect. Now, since we've had that kind of public service, and we have undertakers and we have people who look after us when we're bereaved, there isn't that same need for neighbourliness in the practical aspects of grief and bereavement that we used to need from each other. So you find in Christian teaching down those first 1500 years a continual emphasis on the kindness that we do to each other in times of need, which is the common thread running through Matthew 25, and the kindness that's done especially to strangers. So they don't try and capture everything about what Christians should be doing in those 7 acts of mercy, but they are distinctive acts that we do for those who we may not know, but they're really important charitable service, some of which hopefully we no longer need to do because others take care of each other through society.
Yeah. So Josie and Marion have both submitted questions. Josie's question is, I'd like to thank Bishop Stephen for the last sentence on day 25. Forgiveness and mercy are more than just strong themes in the life and teaching of Jesus. They are the reason that he offered his life. And she says that comment is going to stay with her all year, as did your reflection last year on Give Us This Day Our Daily Bread. But Marion sort of takes that on and turns it into a question, because she says that the early church practiced extreme mercy and forgiveness. But how does this sit with the atrocities in the Ukraine today?
I think that the practice of justice, whether through criminal courts or international courts when it comes to war crimes, is separate from the individual Christian's response to be merciful and forgiving. So if somebody commits a crime against society or against innocent individuals, it is right in human justice and through the courts and the prison service that they as it were, are pay the price for that in terms of the court system, and perhaps be sent to prison or something, or have their liberty curtailed, and also to prevent their harming someone else. But at the same time, those who are victims of that crime have to work through their own response to that. And it's never easy to work that through to a point of forgiveness. And for some people, that takes many years, and they need an awful lot of support in order to do it. But Jesus holds out that goal of forgiveness, both in the Lord's Prayer and in the Beatitudes, as a very high goal and as the most healing response to what might be quite terrible crimes. So I would think that I would say the two things are distinct and need to be held separately. Christians are called to practice mercy and forgiveness, but we still need our legal system and our justice system for protection, and that applies to international crimes as well.
And perhaps that's reflected in Jeff's question. Can you tell us a bit more about what it means to be pure in heart? What does this mean to an individual in today's world?
Thank you. I think to be pure in heart actually is one of the hardest of the Beatitudes to understand and to get inside. But I think at the heart of it is the question of integrity and honesty with yourself and with others, and seeking to be on the inside what you are claiming you are on the outside. So in today's image-conscious society, a lot of people do try and live their lives, as it were, from the outside in, and we project an image of ourselves, which isn't always accurate on the inside. And the call to be pure in heart turns that inside out and says, no, don't start with your image, start with who you are within, which itself, like looking in the mirror, demands some courage of us, really, and lets us know instantly that we need God's grace in that.
That's really interesting, because Richard then picks up on what you're saying about the Beatitudes there. And he says not only is the Beatitudes a list of the ideal characteristics of a person looking in the mirror, but perhaps also a consecutive series of stages on the pathway to the kingdom and transformation, which every individual treads during their faith journey. Is that something you would agree with?
I can see how people say that, and some of the commentaries have tried to say that over the years on the Beatitudes, but I'm not sure I can see it as sequential. In some ways I can, because I think a natural place to begin for all the Beatitudes is to be poor in spirit. But then that doesn't necessarily lead straight to mourning, which leads to being merciful and compassionate and so on all the way through. I prefer to see them in the round. And one of the clues to that is the way in which all Hebrew poetry works. Hebrew poetry, through the Psalms and the prophets, and the tradition in which Jesus was working, doesn't work as English poetry does through rhyme and meter. Hebrew poetry works largely through what's called parallelism of meaning. So you say one thing, and then you say the same thing, but in a different way, in a way that sheds light on the same thing that you've just said. And I think the Beatitudes are in many ways describing the same thing, the character of Jesus and the Christian character and what it means to be human, but they're describing that in 8 different ways. And it's very interesting that by the time you get to the 8th Beatitude, you come back to the same promise you had at the beginning, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And the whole thing has moved round in a kind of circle. So I prefer to understand them in that circular, multi-dimensional way, rather than as sequential. But there have been very good attempts to do that. So the question is not alone.
I'm just going to move us through to Jeremy's question. Jeremy highlights the case of that Gary Lineker has made the news recently for speaking up for the voiceless. And he's from All Saints at Boyne Hill. And he's saying that they've been blessed there with Iranian asylum seekers who've brought a vibrancy to the community over the last year. Intelligent people looking for acceptance and new life in this country. So listening to your talks for day 21, 22 and 23 about being communities of grace and acts of mercy, his question really is to seek justice by living actively and campaigning for advocacy. What does that look like to you? How can we do that and build that?
Thank you. I'm very moved by what I see happening across the diocese in different places as people engage with refugees and asylum seekers in different places. And I think it does operate at a number of different levels. There is practical support and befriending, which represents quite a courageous step sometimes when people don't speak our own language or never been here before. And I see a lot of that happening. And then I also see where people really get to know others who've suffered so terribly and so you need so much help. That turns itself into more active advocacy and political advocacy. And that might include lobbying members of parliament. It might include lobbying local councils to make better provision for refugees and asylum seekers. And as everybody watching this will be aware, there's a whole national debate going on at the moment about how we deal with and provide safe routes for those who want to come as refugees to Britain. And of course, it means addressing the tensions which sometimes arise in communities when a lot of people come in from the outside all at once and who don't readily fit people's ideas of who should be in their community. I think Christians have a really important part to play at every level of practical help, befriending, political advocacy, and also overcoming fear and suspicion locally to build good, cohesive communities.
Now, Bishop Stephen, we promised you a difficult personal question each time. So Marina would like to know which beatitude do you find personally challenging? While you're thinking about that, she said she finds blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness the most difficult for her. But what might be the most challenging for you?
Thank you. I think probably all of them in different ways I found challenging at different times. I think the persecuted for righteousness' sake is probably top of my list because it's never easy to bear difficulty for the sake of your Christian faith or resistance to your particular ideas and views, and sometimes doing things which are going to provoke some kind of persecutional reaction you have to think very carefully before you do it and find the courage to go there. So I think that probably is the most immediately challenging for me, but in different ways I've found them all challenging. Even something as seemingly comfortable as blessed are the merciful can really be challenging when you remember the call to forgive 70 times 7, really that merciful. That stretches us all to our limits. But that's one of the reasons I love the Beatitudes, is that they do stretch us.
So one of the ways in which the three of us have structured Come and See each of the last 3 years is that it's suitable for people who are coming to faith or people who've got an established faith. And we had a range of questions for you this year around personal faith, and it ranged from questions about does God exist, all the way through to some really challenging stuff for individuals. But I thought we've got a couple of different questions to run through here. But I chose Catherine's as the first one, and she was really honest about she's been struggling quite a lot during Lent, as have I, Catherine, I've got to be honest. But she did say that without Come and See, she'd have missed a really key thing, which she's made a note of, which is rewriting the code at the heart of the universe so that all may flourish. Was, really touched her. Could you just expand on that just a little bit more, Bishop Stephen, for those that might have missed that particular phrase?
I think what that phrase is trying to catch, and what the whole of Come and See this year has tried to catch, is that the Christian gospel, the message of Jesus, has something really profound to say to the world as it is at the moment. We do face as a world a number of huge challenges and crises in the next decade, and humanity is casting around for meaning and for good news in that. There are different ways of understanding them, but one of the key ones, I think, is that people are looking for significance and meaning, and they're looking for that significance and meaning in a number of different places. But I think the meaning Jesus offers is in these qualities of living your life as dependent on God, being poor in spirit, living your life in humility, not self-aggrandizement, living your life seeking justice for others, not just more for yourself. And I think all of those Beatitudes and all the others have the capacity to change the way people see the whole meaning of life, really. And that changes your view of other people, and it changes your view of the universe, and it changes your view of what the future can be, and brings hope. And I just think that is such a powerful thing in the present moment. And those of us who've been Christians for a long time have maybe forgotten, because we're familiar with the message and teachings of Jesus, just what a radical, powerful message it is. And like a genetic code, then ripples out into generations of individuals or plants that might flow from that code. So huge amounts of good flows from these 8 sayings.
Thank you. Staying with that sort of life's a bit difficult at the moment, both Stella and Samantha had some interesting questions for us. So Stella was asking, what should people do when they're feeling disillusioned about life and no longer certain about what God wants? So something around listening to God there. And then Sam was saying, how can we know for sure that as individuals we're following God's will and purpose for our lives on a daily basis? Samantha says, I'm very conscious of stepping out and feel I might be holding back as a result, waiting for God's signal. What would you say to Sam and Stella about hearing God's word?
Those are really interesting and important questions. I think I would say in both questions, this is the moment to talk to somebody about that. And we can all process a certain amount by ourselves, and that can be good and helpful. But especially after an experience like journeying through Come and See, it's really helpful and important to have a conversation with someone you trust about how you can grow on from here as a Christian disciple. And there are details that we can signpost and that local churches can signpost of how to have a conversation and develop what we call in the Diocese a personal discipleship plan, which is a conversation with somebody who's trustworthy and a little bit further ahead of you on the Christian life, to just help you discern what the next steps are, what the good habits are that you can begin to build and develop. We'll look at those in the final week of Come and See, of course, and also what your calling is and how you can go on growing from here. None of us can live the Christian life on our own. We need each other. And if you've gone deeper with Come and See, it can be a really good moment to seek to go deeper, going beyond Come and See as we move into the future.
So we were talking about listening to God, and Penny had quite a challenging question, which is, some church leaders will say things like God thinks this or God thinks that, and God is upset when such and such happens. And her question is really simple: how do they know? And sort of related to that, she's been told God's preparing a new rector for our churches. But was he preparing the people of Turkey and Syria for the earthquake? If you were sat with Penny right now, Bishop Stephen, how would you answer those challenges?
Thank you. I think I say first that all of us should speak cautiously and carefully about what we think God thinks, particularly about individual situations. And the way we learn to understand God's ways is to get to know God ourselves and to spend time with God and to spend time in the Scriptures and really dwell in that. But we should be careful and provisional about using language like that, because God is the maker of heaven and earth and much bigger than we are. And I guess that's part of what Jesus means being poor in spirit. He is actually not speaking with undue confidence about some of those particular things. But I think we can be confident in terms of these terrible tragedies that happen to people, such as the earthquake in Egypt, that they are not God's deliberate intention or creation. They happen for reasons we don't fully understand, because something goes wrong, in that case, deep in the natural world, and that's compounded also in the case of the earthquake in Turkey by the very flimsy accommodation in which a lot of people were housed, which magnified the tragedy. So I'm very, very cautious indeed about laying all of that or any of that at God's door directly. And I think discerning the hand of God in human life is a really challenging and difficult thing. But again, we do it best through conversation and through talking. And if anyone is deeply grieved about that, then one of the things that can help most is to share that thought and question with someone else and get their perspective on it.
Thank you. So we're going to continue with those challenging questions, and Tina's going to lead us through some of the questions we've had around where the Church of England is at today.
So the first couple of questions are around the fact that we're all getting older. And Scylla says that what's missing from the Church of England, so that many congregations have an average age over 70 now. Rosemary picks up on that also, and she says, thank you for Come and See. It's been a great discipline in her life. But her question is, all her friends and neighbours are elderly, and the church is unable to give them the help and support it once did, because some of the church ministers are also getting older and can't do and are not able to do some of the regular visiting. So how do you see the ministry to the elderly in the coming years?
Thank you. It's interesting. I thought the question at the end was going to be the opposite one, which is how does the church grow younger? Really?
I would want you to actually answer both. So hold that thought.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Because
Yeah.
I think
Well,
Scylla picked up on that. Scylla was saying, that the young are missing from our churches, wasn't she?
yeah. I think in terms of ministering care for the elderly, I think a big part of being the Christian church is care for one another and mutual care. And I think in older congregations, we see that exemplified all the time, actually. So through the terrible experiences of COVID, the most resilient churches across the diocese have been the small rural congregations, which have grown back much faster after COVID and reached their pre-COVID levels. I think because people have looked out for each other. And you can do that at any age until you yourself become infirm. But I think the church has grown out of the idea that everybody has to be looked after by the vicar. Of course, clergy are concerned with pastoral care, but it's the mutual care that can happen, which is so powerful and which creates these loving communities in every place. I think it is a real priority for every church to try and grow younger in different ways and to reach out to children and young people. And I would say if your church doesn't have children and young people, then the place to begin is by praying and meet together with 2 or 3 other people if you can and pray families and children and young people back into your church. After you've prayed for a while, think about what next steps you can take, but be prepared to start small with the families who are there in your community and imagine what would be a good way of loving and serving them. And often what results out of that is a whole new congregation for children and families and their parents. Might be on a different day at a different time than your Sunday's service. But there's a great team in Church House who can help. And there are many, many examples of work with children and young people being renewed across the diocese. And I hope and pray that's going to grow and grow over these next years.
And Sinead picks up on that very point, which she talks about what can we do in our churches to make them more of a community, I suppose an all-age community, and how do we deal with, and how do you feel about the decline in faith among our young people? But Renee picks up on, I think, the point that you've just made, because she says, how can we motivate young people to look up to God again? And I suppose what you're talking about is us getting to understand their motivations, to meet them where they are.
Yeah,
and perhaps the church needs to change.
It's by loving and listening. So I've never forgotten, I was describing this to a group of clergy this week, actually, that humanly speaking, I'm a Christian because somebody in my local church, when I was 12, 13, started a youth group for 3 people, of whom I was one. And the person who did that didn't feel qualified to do it. She felt very inadequate about starting it. But she took that step of faith. And it was through that little youth group that formed that I came to Christian faith in my teens, and so did a whole group of other people. This is not about coach loads of young people turning up in every church across the diocese. It's about 2s and 3s and love and care. Every single teenager needs to know that they're cared for and loved, and to have people outside their family that they can talk to about faith. And we can provide that in our churches. And we can build good parent and toddler groups in every place. And we can welcome children to church on Sundays. And I think we should be disturbed that there are not children in many of our churches. It should be something that makes us pray and keeps us awake a bit at night until it's put right.
Leslie says that she's really enjoyed Come and See emails and enjoyed the Sunday videos, but she feels that the church needs to address the problem of encouraging people to get to know Jesus in informal ways, rather than just getting them into church. What's your views on that?
I think we all need informal ways to think through our faith and talk to others about our faith, and to pray and to worship, as well as the very formal ways. And especially if you're relatively new to church, you may not know the hymns that others know, you may not know your way around a service book, but you're still enormously welcome. And sometimes you need to learn those things through the informal ways of meeting. So again, lots of churches have started new congregations and ways of helping people to come into faith in lots of informal ways. So it will often be a both and in most places. The BBC radio stations reach so much of our population not because everybody is listening to Radio 4, but because they offer different styles of Radio 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 and local radio. And that's what the church needs to do in our generation too.
Probably get away with talking about church at this time without a quick chat about living in love and faith. So for those that are watching or listening in and don't know what that is, LLF is a process that the church has been through over a number of years now to talk about human sexuality, relationships, marriage, caring for one another. And that culminated in a set of proposals from the bishops that went to something called General Synod in February. And Bishop Stephen has previously written a booklet called Together in Love and Faith, all about it. And you'll find the links to all of that on the website. But Bishop Stephen, first of all, where have we got to in that process?
Thank you, Stephen. Well, it's been a long journey, and the process has been going on for 5 or 6 years. But in February of this year, the bishops brought a set of proposals to the General Synod, which the General Synod approved, and that was to provide what are called prayers of love and faith, which can be used with and by and for couples in same-sex relationships as a service of blessing for those relationships, and promise some pastoral guidance. The Synod approved those proposals, and we're in a period now where that additional work is being done before, I hope and pray, that guidance and those prayers are commended later this year. So we're in a kind of interim period when we know the direction of travel, but we're not quite there yet. At the moment, nothing has changed in the life of the Church of England. And as a diocese, we're listening to each other's responses and reactions to that.
So that's an important thing. So not everybody in every church will agree with what the bishops have suggested. They have either not gone far enough or they've gone too far. So where we've got differences of opinion within the congregation, between the congregation and the PCC, between the PCC and the clergy, between churches and churches, how do we hold that as a church, Bishop Stephen?
I think with love and patience, and I'd actually come back to the Beatitudes, and with meekness and humility and dependence on God, but definitely take time. I mean, a lot of churches have made some progress in this through engaging with the Living in Love and Faith materials, and if your church hasn't, then this may be a good time to do that. We prepare for this significant possibility of change. I'm sure churches and clergy will respond in different ways. Some will opt in to use the prayers, nobody will have to use them, and others will choose not to on principle. And there'll be lots of discussions, I would imagine, in PCCs. I'd encourage people to wait until we know the final detail of the prayers before engaging in too much planning around them. But the church over my lifetime has engaged with a significant number of issues of change on which people have taken different views, often quite heated, and has found a way to live with diversity and tolerate different views while still moving forward. That happened over the remarriage of people who've been divorced in church, and it's happened over the ordained ministry of women as deacons and priests and bishops. And I'm sure we can manage that same mutual tolerance and respect and diversity over this issue.
Bishop Stephen and Tina, we're coming into land, and we've had some amazing feedback from people, including this one from Sarah, who's been using the school's leaders guide, is running a lunchtime club with KS1 and KS2 kids, and she asks, can we have more? So, Bishop Stephen, is there going to be another come and see?
Well, I hope so, God willing. There'll be another come and see next year. We've only got so far as choosing the text, and the text for us next year will be Jesus' summary of the commandments. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength, and you shall love your neighbour as yourself. So that's the text we'll be exploring. But I have some serious work to do in the coming months with others as we begin to plan for next year. But it has been, I have to say, fantastic to have all the feedback this year. And I've just been in awe when I've sat down to say my prayers each morning and listened and read the daily email with everybody else. All the thousands of people who've been engaging with Come and See this year, and it's been really great to travel together. And Tina and Stephen, thank you to you too, especially for your leadership and help in this, because it couldn't happen without you.
Well, thank you. Well, it's been a brilliant team effort from everybody across the diocese. Thank you for taking time to watch this film, and we hope you found Bishop Stephen's answers helpful. And we'll pop a link into personal discipleship plans on the email that accompanies this film. So thanks again, and bye-bye for now.
The material is all there. It will make your work easier as a vicar, an incumbent, a minister in the parish. The big work is in inviting people, which if you encourage parishioners to do, encourage parishioners firstly, encourage them to bring a friend, I think you would have done the bulk of the work. The rest is just to sit down together, either watch the video and then have the questions that are all there to follow yourselves and have a discussion, and you just have a lovely time together. So I would definitely highly recommend it to any parish.